everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Cynthia Overton. I am Senior Director of Tech Workplace Initiatives at the K-4 Center. We are a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to leveling the playing field in the tech industry. I'm really glad that you chose our panel to attend. Social change or scaled inequities, being intentional about creating an inclusive metaverse. And I'm so excited about our discussion because we have at least two amazing panelists. We're hoping for three amazing panelists. I know that she's having a hard time. So Jessica Santana, she is the co-founder and CEO of America on Talent. Oh, just perfect timing, Jessica. I was just introducing you. Welcome.
Yes, so sorry. I've been having some technical difficulties with my Mac this afternoon, but it's really nice to see everyone.
That is okay. I love the fact that you're just diving right in. So Jessica, she is the co-founder and the CEO of America on Tech and the co-founder of the High Tech Heroes NFT project. And Jessica, I hope that you'll tell us a little bit about that project. I'm really excited about that drop. We also have Cliff Lee. Cliff is an associate professor and director of educators for liberation, justice, and joy at Mills College and scholar in residence at YR Media. And then finally, we have my friend, Michael Barron, who is senior partner and he leads digital solutions at Inquest Consulting. And Michael is the author of the book Subtle Acts of Exclusion. Now, before we get too deep into our conversation, I think that it's important that we kind of just talk about the metaverse, what it is, what folks need to understand about the metaverse to really appreciate this conversation. So, I know that it's predicted that we will be fully immersed in the metaverse within the next 5 to 10 years. At that time, we'll see like a strong convergence of our digital worlds and our physical worlds. The metaverse is supposed to revolutionize how we work, how we shop, how we socialize. I don't know how many of you all have seen the movie Ready Player One, but I got to tell you, the idea of people being in different places physically and having these really rich experiences with extended reality is really amazing. We see that a little bit now, and not a little bit, we see that in the gaming world. We see that in virtual worlds on the blockchain. But the idea of this, deep immersion is something else. So I'm just going to ask our panelists to share if there's anything else that you think that folks really should understand about the metaverse for context for this conversation. That would be phenomenal. And I see a comment, Alana wants to know, what is a good definition of the metaverse? And I have heard Jessica speak and talk about Web3. I hate to put you on the spot, Jessica, but I'm going to ask you to kick this off, this conversation about what is the metaverse?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first and foremost, it's so nice to be in community with everyone. When I think about the metaverse, I think people call it the metaverse, but I don't know that there is one metaverse. I think there are just many, many, many metaverses that are in development. Some of us, are familiar with metaverses like Sandbox. Some of us might be more familiar with other types of metaverses that are being developed, but there isn't one centralized place that is called the metaverse that is being developed. There's just a whole bunch of them that are being developed. And the ways in which that I like to think about the metaverses are that they are alternative community spaces that are happening within a virtual environment that mirror, that can mirror, not always mirror, but that can mirror real life experiences in communities, in the ways in which that we build them, in the ways in which we monetize them, and in the ways in which we interact with them. So that is the best way that I personally would envision and describe the metaverse, but we'd love to hear what Michael and Cliff also have to share on this.
All right, Michael, Cliff, who'd like to go next?
I can go because Jessica, you took the words right out of my mouth in terms of many different metaverses. And if we're thinking about, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that means we might have to address those all separately and differently for all the different metaverses, right? We might have some metaverses that are super inclusive and others that aren't. And so that, just like we do now with corporations, we have some corporations that do diversity, equity, and inclusion really well, others that don't. And so we need different strategies. We have different starting places in our work with different corporations. And it may be that way with metaverses too. And of course, when we talk about metaverses, we're also maybe talking about things like digital assets and NFTs and things that are going to intersect with metaverses in different ways. So I think of it all as one kind of big umbrella that we can talk about DE&I with respect to all of that.
Yeah, right. I think Jessica and Michael did an excellent job of summarizing it. I would just add that, it is a virtual computer generated environment that attempts to connect community and people together in different ways. I just emphasize that part because I think about that mirror can be, it's not quite a mirror because it, folk can create whatever avatars or forms of what they want themselves to be that's different from the actual person in reality.
All right. And I'm going to just put in a link to Matthew Ball's primer on the metaverse. This is what I took a little certificate program through Every Realm. And this was one of the resources that they identified as kind of like the central primer when it comes to really understanding the metaverse and the metaverses within the metaverse. So that might be something that is helpful for folks to take a look at and read. So my next question for you all is, what are some of the things that make you really excited when it comes to opportunities that the metaverses will afford? And what does this mean for how we work? All right. So I'm going to ask Cliff to lead us off on this. Oh, Jessica, were you about to start?
I was going to jump in, but Cliff. Okay.
No, go ahead, Jessica. I think you're more experienced than me. Go ahead.
No. I don't think that I'm more experienced than you. So the ways in which I think I'm excited about the metaverse is that I think we've really entered a renaissance with technology, and that there is a renewed interest in this space in a way that I don't know that I've seen people interested in this space before. I think with the introduction of Web 2, everyone, was following things like the .com bubble, and then everyone wanted to start working for Google and Microsoft. And what happens when these companies become mature and they're no longer seen as startups, and they themselves become like the institutions that many people were trying to run away from when they started working in tech in the first place. And so I think for me, what I'm really excited about is that I feel like there's a renewed interest in this space. And I think that that interest in it of itself is leading to a lot of innovation, specifically with the communities that we work with at America on Tech. We work with primarily Black and Brown communities. And everyone knows that we are high adopters of technology. We really love the idea of being able to create in technology. We create some of the best content on the web that is funny, that is exciting. And so I think that with the introduction of the metaverse and this interest, you're going to see a lot of innovation coming from creators that are Black and Latinx in a way that like we haven't seen before. I think the other thing is that there is a financial and economic empowerment piece that also really excites me, because the cool thing about being able to create in an online realm is that there are so many barriers to entry that are eliminated. And granted, I'm not saying that this space is equitable, but I am saying that with the right tool and the right resources and the right trainings, this can be an avenue towards economic mobility for communities that we serve at our organization. And I think the last thing I'll say is that I think maybe what does it mean for workplaces is that I think people, especially with what happened with COVID-19, these this is an opportunity for workplaces to think really creatively about how they can build community in an online environment, since so many companies are becoming decentralized from their physical offices into more of a virtual environment. And I also think it's important for workplaces to really adapt to this idea that people want to have these virtual personas that can really define the ways in which they interact with work. So I think it has huge implications for the future of work. But I'll stop there because I feel like I shared a lot.
No, so I'm actually going to have to ask you to continue for a second. Hold off on us, Cliff and Michael, because I got to tell you, Jessica, you've been in this space for so long, and you are so well versed on this that you can just shoot all this information out, and it might be a little high level. So there are a couple things that you talked about that I really think is important for people to understand. And that's first of all, this whole idea of decentralization. You know, we hear a lot about decentralization when it comes to any asset related to the blockchain, including as we think about metaverses. So can you just tell us a little bit more, or just speak a little bit more about decentralization and what that means in terms of the metaverse or metaverses?
Yeah, for sure. And I would say, that I'm still very much learning because this space is changing all the time. But I think the cool thing about decentralization is that it takes power away from institutions and gives power to the people to be a part of decision-making structures in ways in which they were not included before. I will also say that, like, in some way or form, like, decentralization also still in some way creates some kind of institution, especially if like you have people behind the code that like are not inclusive of like what people want to include. And so I think that like when I think about decentralization though, is that it is like the ability to remove power from old-fashioned systems and giving power to the people to create new systems in a way that feels autonomous and in a way that feels like, we're moving away from really big things, saying yes or no to the things that we want to do. And granted, it is not all black and white. Even with decentralization, there are still lots of things that are there's still lots of things that are regulated. There's still some things that are inequitable that create structures of power that you can't necessarily, you have to admit that still exists. But I think that like the more people get into blockchain and the more people learn these skills, we can actually empower people to make better decisions around how to engage in decentralization in a way that's more equitable.
And just as a quick example about what you were saying in terms of power to the people, it makes me think about the company that had the one example. Well, it's a company that, and I'm not really clear on all the details, operates as a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, which means that people who are customers, this is the whole, what was it, the ENS name? People who are customers have the ability to vote. So there was somebody who was in the C-suite who made very insensitive remarks about a specific group of people. Initially, all the facts had not come out, and there was a vote on whether or not to remove this executive. And they voted to keep him. And then the facts came out, everything came out. And somebody was like, oh no, we got to revote. They had him out within a matter of hours. So I think that that's a really interesting example of, how power to the people, in this case, a DAO, a decentralized organization, can really revolutionize organizations. Cliff, what are you excited about when it comes to opportunities, metaverse opportunities, especially to work?
Yeah, I think some of the things around like the possibilities and potential for like what we've already seen with virtual reality, augmented reality. I think of the projects that some of my artist community organizer friends, like where they've taken history like for example, in Oakland, they took historical archives of like the Black Panthers, and they put it where you can, just put up your phone in a location that you can, rewind back 40 years ago and see what was actually there. So you can change that history from this, period of time that a lot of young kids think about, like, oh, how does it affect me, to literally seeing it in reality in front of them. And I think along with that, like the virtual reality of like, continuing the hope and imagination of what is possible, when sometimes folks might feel like, due to various, systemic and structural inequalities, it makes it difficult to imagine something different of the possibilities that might exist there. And in terms of work, I haven't thought too much about this part. And I'm actually, some of the things that Jessica talked about makes me think about, I think, some of the further questions we'll talk about, some of the challenges, but also I'm thinking about like, who are the creators that are developing these technologies and tools? And that's where a lot of my research has been working with teens and young adults, rethinking what computer science generally is and how it can be utilized, not just in a technical sense of like knowing how to, write code or Java or something, but really thinking about the challenges and problems and opportunities that exist in their worlds, and how do you use the technology in service of inequities and inequalities that they see in their world. So I think it might have a similar outcome in what they create, but it's the forefronting of inequality and oppression, and those types of concerns, like at the heart of what we do, and that technology is a tool to work towards that goal.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Michael, thoughts on being excited?
I'm just excited. My brain is firing with everything you're saying, Cliff and Jessica. I'm agreeing with so much of that, especially the equity piece, the art piece. We know so much more now about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the way that like bias, when it seeps into algorithms, can mess that stuff up so badly. Like we know so much more about that now than we did at the start of like Web 2, for example. That's super exciting to me. We're at like you could say the start of this technology. And so there's so much opportunity to really be intentional. You've said that word a couple of times, Cynthia, to really be intentional about setting these spaces up in ways that are really equitable and inclusive for everyone, especially folks who have been marginalized. So that's one thing that gets me really excited. The other thing is I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. And so when I start thinking about metaverses and online personas, I find it really fascinating in terms of like who you get to be in these spaces. And is the way you can just be in these spaces different than the ways that maybe you're confined to certain boxes in the non-metaverse world, right? Which is interesting and has a lot of potential. I have an 8-year-old who I'm hanging around with a lot this week because it's spring break. And one thing that's really striking me, and I think him too, is as far as gender expression goes, he's not very, like, he doesn't scream boy. Like, he is a boy, but he doesn't scream boy. He's got this long blonde hair and kind of delicate features. And so everyone that he meets and that interacts with him is like, hey, are you a boy or a girl? It's one of the first questions that they ask. And it's so fascinating because he seems like not very bothered by it, but kind of bothered by it. Like, why do you care? And why are you making me choose? And why do I have to tell you this right now? Like, we're just playing in a pool, what does it matter? And so when I step back and think big picture as a cultural anthropologist, I'm like, wouldn't it be interesting if there are just different ways of being that are facilitated by these metaverses? And that's kind of cool to think about.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that there'll definitely be a lot of opportunity there. I mean, you can present as a human being, you can present as a horse, you can present as anything that you want to. And as I think about, what does that mean in the workplace? What would it be like if we had interviews where one's identity was an avatar, and so you couldn't tell what a or an avatar that wasn't necessarily human, so you couldn't tell what somebody's gender or race or whatever might be. As I think about kind of like opportunities when it comes to work, I also think about opportunities to connect virtually in more meaningful ways with colleagues who are across the country. I have a friend at his job. They actually purchased everybody a headset, an Oculus headset, so they could have their holiday party together. So they had their holiday party together in a metaverse. And so I think that there's just going to be a lot of applications when it comes to work. And as you said before, Michael, I think that this is just a really special time in terms of being at the point where we can build for inclusion. I think that, Michael, not to call you out, but I know you were around with Web 1, so was I. And we were kind of just like, oh, okay, what's going on? And then Web 2, and it became very, the disparities became much more clear. But now with Web 3, we think about metaverses. I think that there's a real opportunity to shape in a way for everybody to feel included and for everybody to feel as though they belong, and essentially for co-creation. And that's where I really kind of want to get into the heart of this discussion in terms of what are some of the things that we need to really think about as we move forward into Web3 and as we start to create these different metaverse experiences. So what social concerns do you see in extended reality today? And what are your concerns as our physical and digital lives continue to converge? And any workplace implications that you can think of? Cliff, why don't you get us started with this?
Yeah, sure. I really like a lot of what sociologist Ruha Benjamin, have talked about in her books. Like she calls the new Jim Code. So basically, her argument in looking at what's happening in a lot of our technology spaces is we have this sense that technology is neutral and objective. And yet, through countless examples between her and Sophia Noble and Algorithms of Oppression and Joy Buolamwini with like the Algorithm Justice League, we've seen over and over again how many of our technological tools are inherently racist, sexist, and just biased towards different groups. And, a lot of the heart of these issues come from the fact that, the reality is most of I'm talking about platform developers, not the media developers, are still predominantly cishet, white, and East Asian males. And so, not saying that they can't create inclusive technologies, but they have a much more limited vision of what might be possible, right? And so a lot of the work that I've been doing at Wire Media is like really educating our young people to be the next generation of technologists. And at the heart of what we do is really thinking about the issues of equity and inclusion. Is a lot easier because the majority of our young people are Black and brown, non-binary, LGBTQ. So that's who they are. That's thinking about like building tools for themselves and their community. And so I think that's part of one of the major possibilities and potential of this work. Is like unlike the previous versions of tech, maybe we can think about like, how does it look like if it doesn't come from one of the big corporate entities of developing new tools? Like what would it mean if we put technology in the hands of the liberators and the people that have and been marginalized in the past? And what kind of tools would they create, not just for like profit generation or entertainment, the next fun social media platform, but really to address like systemic inequalities? Like how can we create tools that would reduce violence? How would it create like, I don't know, virtual reality training, programs to reduce the implicit bias in policing or things like that? I mean, that would be powerful, but I feel like that a lot of the money right now maybe is shifting. I think in 2020, that's shifted the conversation a bit, but that's where I feel like we need to go to, really get at the heart of where we're at the crossroads of developing these new tools.
Yeah, I agree with you, Cliff. My biggest concern, I think about folks carrying all the baggage from the physical world into our virtual experiences. I think about AI and machine learning, quite frankly, scaling racism and sexism. And that's something that really frightens me. I was sharing with Cliff a story of me being in Decentraland, and I created an avatar that resembled myself in real life. And I literally was assaulted in Decentraland. I mean, the thought that an avatar would be assaulted was just strange to me. And then I realized it's very common. So now I have given myself a different persona. I am a white guy named Chuck. As reference to Ready Player One, and I have never been assaulted since, presenting myself as a white male named Chuck. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Michael, what social concerns do you have as we enter this new era of the metaverse?
Well, those biases are one for sure, right? Those biases in our heads are in our heads and literally kind of encoded into our brains from the socialization, from the culture. And those biases are going to travel with us into the metaverse. So that's a big one. I think the people thinking that solutions are too easy is a concern that I have. Like, well, it's younger generation and they have different friends and they in their social groups. And so, it's all going to be fine. When in fact, the research shows that those younger generations have some of the same unconscious biases as older generations. And so it's not just going to all be fine. Or like, oh, this NFT project has a diversity of skin tones. So like, it's all good. It's inclusive. Well, that's a little bit too simplistic of a way to think about it. It's way more complicated than that. So those are some concerns I have. Also, mental health and human connection, right? I don't know that we know how this is all going to play out when more of our connections are in metaverses rather than maybe face to face. I think some research shows that during the pandemic, the Zoom work experiment, we've connected a lot, sometimes with people we knew really well, but when it happened virtually, it didn't feel the same as it does when it happens in person. The connections weren't the same. And so that worries me too, in terms of people's mental health. Like, it's a different way of connecting, but it's not the same thing. These days we hear a lot of folks, a lot of our clients in workplaces are like, okay, well, we're going back to work April 1st, as if it's just simple and straightforward. Like, we're going to come back into a building after not having seen each other face to face. That's not a simple thing. If we really want to take inclusion seriously, we need to think about what's our return to work process. What's the process for people who have never met their colleagues? I think we're kind of going along and leaving some things unquestioned that really need intentional inclusion to build those human connections, and to think about what really happens when we have those connections virtually or digitally rather than in person. I know some research is starting to look into that, but I don't know if we know the long-term effects yet. So I worry about that.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that really concerns me, because I kind of feel as though people look at anything related to blockchain or Web3 as like a silver bullet in terms of it's going to fix everything. And I don't hear folks having a lot of conversations going deeper. It's always very, I shouldn't say always, but oftentimes it's very shallow and superficial. And I got to tell you, I don't think I know too many people who've been in more spaces than Jessica, because Jessica has an amazing NFT project that's about to drop. And so she's had conversations, and Jessica, you can slide in information about your NFT project too. And you can explain what an NFT is as well. But she's been in these conversations and in these spaces. So Jessica, I'm really curious to hear from you about how people are talking about inclusion. Now, I'm not talking about, I want you to tell us about High Tech Heroes, but I'm not talking about within that context, because that's a very special and unique context. in general, in terms of within the community, what are you hearing?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's important as we talk about metaverses that we are talking about it also in conjunction with real life reality of what a lot of people find themselves in. You know, in this country, you still have the majority of schools that don't even teach computer science at the K through 12 level. You know, you still have a workforce that is very unskilled to be a part of a lot of the jobs that are being created as a result of the movement towards Web3. And I think it's also important to note that while metaverses are these online spaces that we can create, they are still created not independent of government that regulates our lives on a day-to-day basis. And so when I think about a lot of the conversations that are going on within my community and the communities that I'm a part of right now, it's like, how do we make sure that in the movement towards us having these robust extended reality platforms and Web3, that one, we don't leave people behind in the job creation that happens as a result of the innovation. Two, how do you make sure that you upskill folks to make sure that they have the actual skills to obtain these jobs? And three, how do you make sure that things that are happening in the online virtual environment also are not independent of what is actually legal and lawful in real life spaces? Because I really believe that inequities are a product of bad design. And we've seen over and over again that when you don't have equity at the forefront of the beginning of an innovation, that in and of itself scales inequities as part of that innovation's growth. And so what needs to happen, and what, you know, a lot of the conversations that are going on in the spaces that I'm in about what's needing to happen, is that we need to find players who really value inclusion at the very design, at the very beginning stages of design, to make sure that voices are included in the design process. So it puts the communities that we're building in the metaverses that we're building, it creates an environment where we're building with community rather than building for community. And so I think those are some of the conversations that we're having. And I also generally think that you know, there is a lot of hype right now around Web3, and there's also a lot of miseducation and misinformation going around about like how this space actually works. And what I am afraid of is that that is also going to lead to predatory practices on communities that just don't actually know what this space is and believe that there's an opportunity for them, and now they have invested $10,000 in their last $10,000, which is like their last lifetime savings, thinking that this is going to be the space that blows them up, and knowing how volatile things are, they can lose that life savings in a heartbeat. And so I think those are some of the conversations that are going on, especially in the groups that I'm working with. And I will say that like activism has to happen within the metaverse spaces. And so if you are, you know, a part of decentralized autonomous organizations, like you have the power to like influence, you know, the ways in which people code, who gets to code, who gets to lead. And if you have that kind of power, I totally advise you to use it. Because I think there's also like just general fear around, like, I think people, I think about, and I'll cut it off right after this, and I feel like I'm talking too much, but I feel like what ends up happening in real life spaces is that folks are actually afraid to advocate for inclusion because they know that sometimes they are penalized for it. And what I'm afraid of is that we are going to get to a space where now we're mirroring this same behavior in the metaverse, and it is actually a lot more dangerous because some people are not identifiable, some people are hiding behind avatars, and some people are generally bullies in the space. And as a result of that, you know, we're not going to speak out when it actually matters. And so that's my take on what folks are saying on our end.
All right. So, Was somebody about to say, Michael?
I was just about to say too, there's a financial incentive sometimes, like for people to not speak up, to not create uncertainty or doubt within certain projects, because it could affect the price action of a certain group of NFTs, for example. And so another reason why people may stay silent rather than, introduce that doubt and uncertainty and fear.
Absolutely 100% right, Michael. That's very unfortunate. All right, next topic before we transition to the Q&A. And if you have a question for our panelists, I encourage you to please go on and put that in the Q&A. I see one in the chat. That's just fine too. But please, any questions that you have, go on and start typing those. Otherwise, you're just going to be hearing from me until the top of the hour. Your questions are probably much more interesting. Final topic, will the metaverse lead to social change or scaled inequity? Just quick response. What's in the future here?
I can start. I feel like that maybe the question creates a false binary. It kind of goes back to what Jessica described at the beginning. Like it's both, right? Like just like what we see right now, there's segments of computing innovations up to now has pretty much been in the hands of people with money and deep pockets, right? And so what is it going to look like if we continue to develop the metaverse on that side, where those goals and objectives of those in positions of power are going to continue to create those things? But then we do see pockets of and I feel like I've seen increasingly folks that aren't from the traditional overrepresented groups going into a tech field are getting tired of being in this very programmer space, and they're like, I don't like this. This is not what I went into this field for. And they're leaving and they're creating their own startups and they're creating their own projects with other BIPOC or other women or non-binary, other folks to create the kind of tech tools that they want to see. And so that's giving me hope as well to see that there are possibilities. And increasingly, we are seeing more funding towards that from different VCs, probably as a result of 2020 with George Floyd. So we're seeding more money and resources towards those goals. So it's both, I see evidence of both. And just want to add one other point to what Michael had said earlier about the uncertainty of how the metaverses can impact humans. I mean, I think the Moore's law, where that essentially that idea of computing devices are growing or developing in exponential growth and complexity and computing power in comparison to human development that doesn't operate in that way. We've already begun to see that, I mean, I think many of the audience probably have seen Social Dilemma or, what's the other one? The something bias, I'm forgetting, algorithmic bias. I mean, we know even some of the titans in tech don't realize what the unintended consequences of some of their tools are developing and having an effect on human relations. I mean, I truly believe, myself, even when I've used the Oculus, I'm kind of glad it only has a 2-hour, battery power, because it's a forced, I don't plug it in, but then a forced, departure from that. Because I don't know if y'all have been in it, but, you can feel whoa, afterwards, you're kind of out of it because you're in this different world for such a long time. And I just imagine, even from this anecdotal example, I can imagine, I've heard, folks have been on there for 10 plus hours at a time. And Real Player One, what would it look like in our world if everybody is just in this metaverse world, as opposed to interacting socially, humanly, and naturally with the natural world? I mean, I would imagine people might be like, why do we protect the oceans? We got this virtual ocean right here in the metaverse. I can see the dolphins right here. I can feel like I'm touching them.
Yeah. It's interesting what you said, Cliff, about this false dichotomy. You hear a lot of naysayers about metaverses and Web3 in general. Well, it's impossible that it's going to be this utopic vision. So blah, and whereas look at the inequity we have right now in the non-metaverse world, in the world we're living in now. The inequity is out of control. It's horrific. So I do have hope that these tools will help maybe create some more pockets of inclusion and equity, and that's a good thing, right? Not that it's the magic bullet, like you said, Cynthia, but that we can be intentional and create some social change in a good way, because certainly we are not starting from a great place right now.
Jessica, your thoughts for moving forward in the future?
Yeah, I think that I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an and. I think we can have social change, and with that, we're also going to see scaled inequities. So I don't know that I have anything to contribute except that, if anyone in this audience really believes in creating inclusive Web3 spaces, then you should advocate for that in the same ways in which, we are advocating for it in our own personal work. These conversations have to happen in public. They can't happen in private. I think a lot of times, especially with the groups that I'm in, there's just a lot of fear sometimes with speaking up, because people's jobs are on the line, people's reputations are on the line. But what I would say is that it really takes a small group of committed citizens to make change, and I have to believe that. I have to believe in a brighter future. I can't believe in a future that is a lot more negative, because if not, it doesn't give me the will to fight today. So I guess my only thought is that, whenever you can speak truth to power, that you absolutely do so, because true allyship looks like you losing things in the process of the fight for justice as well. And we can't operate with such an individualistic mindset, not in the real world and not in the metaverses either.
Great, thank you. And I will just, say this. I know that there are a lot of companies that are very forward-looking and are really thinking about their metaverse strategy now. It is my hope that they will assemble teams that are representative of different populations as they develop their metaverse strategy. And what I mean by that is, think about, brands and clothes and all of this we're going to see we see this now in the metaverse, in different metaverse spaces, in terms of clothing, shoes. So a lot of companies are developing their metaverse strategy right now. I hope that they are being intentional about who's contributing to those teams. And I would love to see ERGs, or members of employee resource groups, be contributing to those plans right now, because I think that we'll need that type of inclusion early on to be able to create experiences that are appealing to everyone. And with that, we have a few questions in the Q&A, but I did see this question in the chat posted earlier, and this is about regulation and the legal system. It says it's not on par with the technology or the technological revolution. How will we address this? And Jessica, do you want to talk a little bit about this? I mean, I know that you touched on this a bit earlier in terms of the whole idea of kind of one or the other. You can't really have everything. It's hard to have one or the other. It's hard to have something that is truly decentralized, because if something is truly decentralized, what does that mean about the regs? So can you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah. Every time I think about the law and I think about technology, I think about Mark Zuckerberg. And I think about I forgot when he was being interviewed by Congress, and you had politicians and regulators and policymakers that didn't even know how a company like Facebook made money, right? So I think that there is a general appetite for technological revolution to take over the world, I also believe that there is just inherently a lack of understanding about what technology is and what startups are and how these startups make money, and how all of this is developed in the first place by the people who actually regulate these technologies and regulate corporations. And I did an accelerator a few years back, and there is this gentleman, his name is Travis, his last name skips me, but he started an organization called Tech Congress. And the purpose of Tech Congress is basically to give fellowships to very technologically savvy people and place them in regulatory entities in the United States government that will help them inform regulation in a way in which the current policymakers do not know. So I think that how we address this is making sure that at the point where we have an opportunity to bring content knowledge into policy-oriented spheres, that we do that. I also think the ways in which we address this is making sure that we're creating lawyers that also are very well aware of the things that are going on in the space, so that if they are creating policy or they are trying to affect policy in some kind of way, that they have the knowledge to do so in a way that is inclusive. And I think the other way that we address this is that we elect politicians that don't act like inequities don't exist. And we put power in the hands of people that actually care about the forward movement of our country. And I don't need to get all political, but the reality of the situation is that we do need to make sure that we elect people who care about the same issues that we do and take an active part in our democracy.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And you brilliant on all parts. Something that I hadn't thought about that I think is just a good idea, recommendation, is thinking about the training of these lawyers. And this is something that they really, really need to include in the law school curriculum. Any other thoughts on laws and regs before we move on to our next question? Okay.
Wholeheartedly agree with everything Jessica said.
Yes.
All right. Next question. How do we steward healthy tech practices in the metaverse? And Michael, you talked a little bit about this, and Cliff, so did you, but can you elaborate on that? Michael, I know that you have kids. You think about your kids a lot in terms of tech and equality and of course, health. What recommendations do you have?
This is this is a struggle. This is the struggle for parents these days. Like, when you have the technology and the culture changing so fast, just like trying to figure it out with your kids is mind-boggling and scary, and constantly makes you feel terrible and like the source of conflict, and like it is hard to instill good, healthy tech practices that are like positive, like, and not just defensive. Like,
do you engage with your kids in play games or go into virtual spaces with them?
I don't go into virtual spaces with them. I mean, we try to talk to them. We try to have open communication. We try to be there in the spaces that they're in, just as like a sounding board, and until a certain age, kind of keeping an eye on what they're involved with and how much time they spend in, because it's a continuum, right? It's not like they don't have a digital life and then all of a sudden they will when the metaverse is there. They're much of their life is in the digital world right now. As they engage with their friends, they come home. You might sit there with a device, and we're like, hey, maybe you should be doing something else besides screen time. And they're like, yeah, but I'm hanging out with my friends. Like, this is my social time. And so it's really hard to instill those positive, good habits for them, right? And let alone like healthy. I mean, we don't have healthy workplace habits right now for people, right, that are separate from the metaverse. I think we need a whole culture shift around what it means to work and be a real human. And mental health is such a huge issue these days, and is going to continue to be, I think. So I think this isn't totally divorced from other questions about how do we create healthy work habits and work cultures and work-life balance and digital habits for children and things like that.
Hey,
I would.
Go ahead.
I was reading some place where a guy was saying that his son literally spends more money on his digital clothes than he does on his real life clothes.
Mm-hmm. I believe it.
Interesting. Michael, how old are your kids?
So they're 8, 11, 16, and 18.
Oh, wow. Okay. I was going to to a lot of what Michael shared, because I have a 13 and an 8-year-old. And, this is definitely, I mean, I share a lot of my own research and work with my 13-year-old, 8-year-old, not as much yet. And it's a struggle because just a recent example, like him and his friends want to they created an ASMR channel on YouTube and they want to publish it. And I really struggle with this because on the one hand, maybe I know too much about like how, facial recognition technology and different things, and knowing the story of Robert Williams, the first person arrested using just falsely arrested using facial recognition technology. All these different things are swimming in my head as I'm thinking about this. But at the same time, I'm like, well, they did this thing together. It's harmless, and they're getting agency and confidence and navigating these spaces. So you have to wrestle all those things together. And at the same time, I think, what Michael described as like it, in some ways is a window and a mirror to our realities, is that like, if, you're a young person that you live with, it happens to, have some different, I don't know, mental health, different challenges and whatnot, it can definitely be exacerbated by all these different platforms and things like that, and being in that space. And so being it so unregulated kind of makes me think about, Cynthia, what you shared, being in that, I can't remember the game that we were in with my son and I in the Oculus, but essentially it went to an open room where anybody can join in. And it sounded like a bunch of under 10-year-olds just using profane language, cussing at each other and doing assaulting different avatars and things like that. And, my son was even older than them. He was kind of laughing like, oh my God, who are these kids? What are they doing here? And I'm like, this is what is happening. And like, when there's very little regulation, both at home and, by laws and policies, these things will be perpetuated, over and over again. So it's challenging, how do you give them that, flexibility to be responsible and learn and navigate those spaces and their identities, and develop at the same time, recognizing that there are certain pieces that have been developed to take advantage, like what Jessica said, like prey on the people that are most vulnerable. And I think that will also continue as well too.
Jessica, anything to add before we get to the final question?
No, I think Michael and Cliff did a great job.
All right. Well, the last question is a good question. It's almost I don't know that there's an answer for this, but how can we make the metaverse inclusive for all when some people don't even have cell phones, computers, or consistent access to Wi-Fi? That is a huge, huge issue. It's really interesting because I was in an educational technology program at the University of Michigan. I started in 1999, and we were having these conversations back then. And to think that we would still be having this conversation literally 20 years later is mind-blowing. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I can jump here. Our the work that I do is that we work with youth between the ages of 16 to 24. And they are all from socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, students who are underestimated and possess all the potential in the world. COVID-19 hit, the majority of our students did not have laptops, though they have laptops when they are with us in programming, because we provide that. They did not have laptops at home. And I think that there is this misunderstanding that because Chromebooks are $200, that everyone can now go get a Chromebook, and that should solve issues around access to hardware. But Chromebooks are very limited in the things that you do. You cannot download local software or integrated development environments to code. And so what you force people to do is now have to use like online integrated development environments and coding editors. And that is not the ways in which real engineers actually build strong projects. And so I think that when I think about like building an inclusive metaverse or metaverses, when you have people that don't have access to Wi-Fi, don't have access to connectivity, and don't have access to devices, I think we need to apply pressure on our government systems to actually use our tax dollars in the ways in which they should be used.